The blizzard was supposed to be the worst thing about that night. It wasn't. A retired Navy SEAL, a cabin buried in Montana wilderness, and a 7-year-old girl in a broken wheelchair standing alone on his porch at midnight, her little brother shaking so hard his teeth rattled like loose change. She didn't beg, didn't cry, just looked at him with eyes that had already seen too much and said 4 words that cracked something open in his chest. My brother is freezing. He'd cleared rooms in Fallujah. He'd carried dying men through firefights. He thought he was done being afraid. He was wrong. If you've never seen this channel before, hit subscribe right now, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. You will not want to miss what happens next. The temperature had dropped to 9 degrees by the time Adrian Cole made it back up the ridge trail, and the storm was still building. He could feel it the way men who've spent years in hostile environments learn to feel things. Not through instruments or weather apps, but through the pressure in his sinuses, the particular quality of the wind, the way Ghost moved ahead of him on the trail. The Belgian Malinois had gone lower to the ground in the last quarter mile, ears pinned, nostrils working. Not a threat posture. Something else. Something the dog couldn't categorize, which meant Adrian couldn't either, and that was the part that bothered him. He'd gone into Ridgecrest for supplies that afternoon, a 40-minute drive down a mountain road that was already borderline impassable by the time he started back. The truck had fishtailed twice on the switchbacks above the valley, and the heater had wheezed the whole way like something dying inside the dashboard. He'd bought enough food for 2 weeks, which was his standard whenever a serious system came in. 2 weeks of isolation didn't bother him. 2 weeks of isolation was, in fact, the point. The cabin came into view through the tree line, and Adrian exhaled the kind of breath a man exhales when something tightly coiled in his chest loosens by 1 small degree. He'd built the place himself over 18 months after separating from the Navy, using skills he'd learned from a master carpenter in Kodiak, Alaska, who'd taken a liking to him for reasons neither of them ever fully articulated. The cabin was solid, dark-stained timber with a metal roof that shed snow cleanly, a covered porch running across the front, and a wood stove inside that could push the interior temperature to 70 even when it was 20 below outside. It wasn't beautiful in any magazine sense, but it was his, and it worked, and no one could find it easily, which was the exact combination of qualities Adrian had been looking for when he bought the land. Ghost stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. Full stop, the way he did when he'd identified something that needed Adrian's full attention. Adrian stopped too. His hand didn't go to his hip. He didn't carry on his own property, which was a deliberate choice, a way of drawing a line between what he'd been and what he was trying to become. But his body went into a different kind of readiness anyway, quiet, still, processing. He followed Ghost's eye line toward the porch. At first he thought it was a piece of gear he'd left outside. A bag, maybe, or a tarp that had blown against the railing. The shape was wrong for the porch, too far from the wall, too low to the ground. Then the shape moved. Adrian walked forward slowly, and the shape resolved into a child. She was sitting in a wheelchair that had clearly been through something terrible. The left wheel was bent at an angle that would have made rolling nearly impossible on flat ground, let alone through mountain snow. The footrests were gone, broken off or lost somewhere along the way. The vinyl seat was soaked through, and the girl sitting in it was wearing a winter coat that had been adequate for someone smaller, someone who'd had it for a season too long, the cuffs stopping 3 inches above her wrists. She was 7 years old. He would find this out later. Looking at her in that moment, in the failing light of a Montana blizzard, he would have guessed older because of her eyes. There was something in them that didn't belong to a child, a flatness underneath the fear, a quality of having already made calculations most adults never had to make. Behind her, pressed against the back of the wheelchair with both small hands gripping the push handles, was a little boy. 4, maybe. His face was buried against the coat on the back of the wheelchair, his body shaking in a way that went past shivering into something more systemic, the kind of cold that gets into the muscle and stays. The girl looked at Adrian. She didn't scream, didn't recoil. She'd clearly seen him coming and had already decided something. The way a person decides something when they've run out of other options, and this is the last one on the list. "Sir." Her voice was steady but thin, like a signal coming from a long distance. "Could we stay here just for one night? My brother is freezing." Adrian stood there for 2 seconds that felt considerably longer. He'd been in rooms with men who'd killed people. He'd sat across tables from individuals whose threat assessments had made his own pulse tick upward involuntarily. He had a collection of experiences that most people would classify as the most difficult moments a human being could face. He was not prepared for this. "Come inside," he said. Her name was Sophie. He got that much from her while he was getting them through the door and out of the wind. The boy's name was Liam, and Liam had stopped shaking enough to look at Ghost with the wide, arrested expression of a child who has never been this close to a dog this large and cannot decide whether to run or reach out and touch it. "He won't hurt you," Adrian said. "Ghost, heel." Ghost sat. Liam stared at Ghost. Ghost stared back with the patient, assessing expression that all well-trained working dogs develop. Not aggressive, not friendly in any sloppy sense, just present and watchful. Very slowly, Liam reached out and put one small hand on Ghost's broad head. Ghost didn't move. Some tension Adrian hadn't realized he was holding went out of the room. The cabin's interior was sparse in the way that military life makes things sparse, not from poverty, but from a deeply trained suspicion of anything non-essential. A long table of heavy timber, 4 chairs, a cook stove, a wood stove in the corner already burning, bookshelves built into the wall beside the door, thick with field manuals and tactical texts and a handful of novels he never talked about reading, a rifle case bolted to the far wall, maps pinned above the table, topographic, the kind you actually use rather than display. Adrian lifted Sophie from the wheelchair. She let him, which told him something about how exhausted she was, because he sensed immediately that she was not a child who let people do things for her, and carried her to the chair closest to the wood stove. She was lighter than she should have been. He got Liam up next, peeled the soaked coat off him, and wrapped him in the wool blanket from the footstool in the corner. The boy clutched the blanket and pulled it over his head and disappeared into it, which was fine. Disappearing was a reasonable response to a night like this. "Are you hurt anywhere?" Adrian asked Sophie directly. "Not cold. Hurt. Pain somewhere specific." "My left leg," she said. "Where the brace was. It rubbed through." "Can you show me?" She pulled up the hem of her pants without hesitation, and Adrian crouched and looked at the skin above the ankle where the orthotic had worn into it over what must have been hours of movement. The skin was broken and raw, not infected yet, but close to the edge of it if she'd been out much longer in wet conditions. He got the first aid kit from under the sink. Military surplus, well stocked, the kind of kit that has everything from hemostatic gauze to a surgical needle, and cleaned the wound with the efficiency of someone who'd done this in worse conditions on worse injuries. Sophie didn't make a sound. She watched him work with those steady, too old eyes. "This is going to sting," he said. "I know." It did. She didn't flinch. He dressed it properly, wrapped it, and sat back on his heels. "You've had medical attention before. For your leg." It wasn't a question. He could tell from how she held herself, how she knew what to expect. "Physical therapy," she said. "Before." He didn't push on the before. He got up and went to the cook stove. He had a pot of bean soup he'd made 2 days ago, the kind of thick, plain food that keeps well and reheats in minutes. He put it on the burner, cut 4 thick slices of bread from the loaf he'd bought in Ridgecrest, and set water on for tea without really deciding to. His hands moved through the familiar motions of feeding people, while some other part of his brain ran a slower, more careful process. 2 children. Montana wilderness. Blizzard conditions. A wheelchair that had been pushed through miles of mountain terrain. The boys' clothes were dry enough at the core. Whoever had been responsible for dressing them had put the warmer layer on the inside, which suggested at least some adult competence at some point in the recent past. But they'd been outside long enough for the outer layers to saturate completely. Where had they come from? The nearest town was Ridgecrest, 22 miles down the mountain. The cabin was accessible by 1 road and 1 trail, and the trail was not something you navigated without knowing it was there. "How did you find this place?" he asked, keeping his voice level, the way he'd learned to keep his voice level when he needed honest answers from people who were frightened. Sophie was quiet for a moment. "We followed the smoke." He looked at the chimney, then back at her. The wood stove had been burning since morning. On a clear day, you could see the smoke from 2 miles south on the ridge. In a blizzard, you'd have to be much closer, maybe half a mile, and you'd have to know to look. "You were on the ridge trail?" For a while. Then it got too steep and Liam couldn't keep up. She paused. I walked the last part, held on to trees. He looked at the wheelchair, at the bent wheel, at the missing footrests. She'd walked through mountain snow in a broken brace with a 4-year-old in tow, and then found his cabin by following smoke through a blizzard. He said nothing. He stirred the soup. Liam had migrated from the blanket cocoon to the floor beside Ghost, and was now using the dog's flank as a pillow, his eyes heavy and distant. Ghost had not moved. Ghost was the most disciplined animal Adrian had ever worked with, and Adrian had worked with some exceptional animals. But the dog's patience with the boy at this moment was something that went beyond training. He was choosing it. Adrian served the soup in ceramic bowls, not the tin camp bowls he usually ate from, and he wasn't sure afterward why he made that choice. Sophie ate with careful, deliberate bites, the way people eat when they're very hungry and trying not to show it. Liam fell asleep before he finished his bowl, curled against Ghost's side, his breathing deepening into the heavy, boneless sleep of a very small child who has finally felt safe enough to let go. Adrian sat across the table from Sophie and drank his tea and waited. She met his eyes. Something passed between them. Not words, not any kind of conventional communication, but an acknowledgement, a recognition. I see that you are trying to decide how much to tell me, and I am trying to decide how much to push. You don't have to tell me everything tonight, he said. She looked at her bowl. But I need to know if someone is looking for you, because if they are, and they find this cabin, I need to know it's coming. The pause was long enough that he started to think she wasn't going to answer. Yes, she said quietly. Someone is looking for us. He gave them the bedroom. This was not a natural decision for a man who had spent the better part of a decade sleeping in a cot in a corner of various forward operating bases, and who had arranged the cabin's single bedroom with the particular monastic precision of someone who uses sleep as a controlled tactical resource. The bed was made with military corners. The floor was clear. There was nothing unnecessary in the room. He carried Liam in and put him down without waking him. Ghost followed and stationed himself at the foot of the bed, which Adrian hadn't asked for but also didn't countermand. Sophie transferred herself from the dining chair to the bed with a practiced efficiency that she'd clearly developed over years of navigating spaces that weren't built for her, leading with her arms, managing her weight, settling herself without asking for help. The dog stays with you? She asked, looking at Ghost. Seems like he wants to. She looked at Ghost for a moment. Something in her face shifted. Not softened exactly, but changed. Okay, she said. She looked back at Adrian. Thank you for the soup and the everything. Get some sleep. He pulled the door almost closed and went back to the main room. He built the wood stove up for the night, checked the window locks, all of them, not from habit but from the beginning of something more deliberate, and sat in the chair nearest the door with his tea going cold on the table beside him. Someone was looking for them. He turned that over carefully. A 7-year-old girl with a physical disability and a 4-year-old boy, alone on a mountain in a blizzard, coming from somewhere, running from something. The wheelchair had been pushed hard and fast over terrain it wasn't built for. The brake handle on the left side was broken, not bent from impact, but snapped, the way something snaps under sustained pressure or force. He thought about the way Sophie had said it. Not afraid someone was looking for them. Not hoping no one was looking for them. She said it the way you say something you've already accepted as fact, something you've built your decisions around. Yes, someone is looking for us. He'd heard that tone before. He'd heard it from sources in Mosul who'd already calculated that talking to him was likely to get them killed, but had decided to do it anyway, because the alternative was worse. Adrian sat in the dark and listened to the blizzard work against the roof and thought about all the things he didn't know yet. He didn't sleep. Not a decision, just the outcome of a mind that had been running threat assessments since the moment he'd seen the shape on the porch, and that was not capable of standing down until it had resolved the variables. By 2 a.m, he had a short list. The children hadn't come down the main road. Impossible in the wheelchair on ice, and Liam was too young to have made that walk. They'd come from the north, which meant they'd come off the ridge, which meant they'd either started from the Calvert Creek trailhead, the only entry point to that trail accessible by vehicle, or they'd crossed country from somewhere else, which would have taken considerably longer and been considerably more dangerous. The Calvert Creek trailhead was 11 miles north of the cabin. That was a long way in a blizzard with a broken wheelchair and a 4-year-old. He looked at the bent wheel. He looked at the snapped brake handle. A wheelchair didn't sustain that kind of damage from being pushed down a trail. It sustained that kind of damage from being dropped or thrown or impacted from the side. He was still sitting with that when Ghost appeared in the bedroom doorway. The dog was not in alert posture. He looked back at Adrian with an expression that communicated, with the particular clarity of a well-trained working dog, that everything in the bedroom was fine and that he had decided to resume his post at the door because something outside had changed. Adrian went to the window. The blizzard had dropped enough that the tree line was visible now, a dark mass against a sky that had gone from black to deep purple. The snow was still falling, but lighter, scattered. At the edge of the tree line, 200 meters out, there was a shape that hadn't been there before. Not a deer, too still, too upright. Adrian stood at the window without moving for 90 seconds. The shape didn't move either. Then it was gone. Not walked away, just gone, absorbed back into the trees the way a person goes who knows how to move in darkness. Adrian stepped back from the window slowly, keeping his body out of the angle of sight. He looked at Ghost. Ghost looked back at him, ears forward, the exact expression of a dog that has confirmed something his handler has been slow to accept. They were already found. Adrian didn't move from the window for a long time after the shape disappeared. He ran it back through his mind the way he'd been trained to run things, methodically, without letting urgency compress the analysis into something sloppy. Shape at the tree line. 200 meters. Stationary for 90 seconds, which ruled out an animal moving through. Gone cleanly, no sound, no disturbance in the snow he could detect from this distance. Someone who knew how to move. Someone who had been standing there long enough to observe the cabin's light pattern, the smoke from the chimney, and, potentially, the shadow of a man standing at a window. He'd given himself away by going to the glass. That was a mistake. A basic one, the kind that got people killed in environments where mistakes had consequences. And he'd made it because he was out of practice, and because some part of him had stopped expecting this kind of night. He stepped further back into the room and stood in the dark and let his eyes readjust. Ghost was beside him now, not pressed against his leg, but close enough that Adrian could feel the warmth of the dog's flank. Ghost's ears hadn't moved from their forward position, which meant whatever was out there hadn't gone far. The dog's nose was working. "Easy," Adrian said very quietly. "Hold." Ghost held. Adrian went to the cabinet beside the rifle case and took out the handgun he kept there, a .45 he'd carried for 11 years and maintained with the same regularity. He maintained everything else in the cabin. He checked the chamber by feel, no light, confirmed it was loaded, and moved it to the waistband of his jeans at the small of his back. He didn't put on a holster. If he needed it tonight, he needed it accessible, not secured. Then he went back to the chair by the door and sat down and waited for morning. Sophie was awake when the gray light started coming through the bedroom curtain. He could tell by the silence. The quality of it changed when she stopped sleeping. He'd noticed that in the night, between his sweeps of the windows, that her breathing had a distinct rhythm when she was out and when she was in that shallow, watchful half-sleep that some kids develop when they've spent enough time in situations where being unconscious is a liability. He heard her moving quietly, heard the particular sounds of a child who has learned to transfer herself without waking anyone else. Practiced. Careful. She appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, having somehow gotten herself into the wheelchair. He'd brought it inside and done what he could with the bent wheel, wedging it straighter with a piece of scrap iron from the shed. And she stopped when she saw him sitting in the chair with his tea and the gun no longer visible. She looked at him. He looked at her. "You didn't sleep," she said. "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." He almost said something else dismissive and then didn't because she was right, and because she was looking at him with that expression that made him feel irrationally, like she could see through whatever surface he put up. "No," he said, "I didn't sleep." She wheeled herself to the table and positioned herself across from him. Outside, the storm had dropped further. Still snowing, but the violent driving quality of the blizzard was gone, replaced by a steadier, quieter accumulation. The world beyond the windows was white and still, and visibility was maybe 300 meters to the tree line. He'd done 4 window checks in the night. No further shapes. No tracks visible in the dark. He'd need to go outside when it was fully light to check the perimeter, but he wasn't going to do that while both children were alone inside. Someone was watching the cabin last night, he said. He watched her face. From the tree line, about 2 a.m. She went very still, not surprised. He registered that clearly. Not surprised, but something dropping in her expression, some small thing she'd been holding on to, some hope that they'd bought more time than they had. How many? She asked. He paused. Not a child's question, the follow-up instinct of someone who'd already been thinking in terms of numbers and options. Couldn't tell. One shape. Could be a scout. She looked at the window. Sophie. He kept his voice level. I need you to tell me what's happening, not a version of it, the actual thing. A long silence. Outside, a gust moved through the trees and the snow shifted off the upper branches in small falling curtains. Liam was still asleep. Ghost had gone back to the bedroom when Adrian heard him moving there. The dog had stationed himself and was maintaining. Our parents died 8 months ago, Sophie said finally. Her voice was flat, controlled, but something underneath it was working hard. Car accident. Black ice on Route 9, coming back from Ridgecrest. They died on impact. She paused. We were in the back seat. Liam had his seatbelt on wrong, and I fixed it right before we left because I always check his. The airbags... She stopped, started again. We survived. Adrian said nothing. The fire cracked in the wood stove. Our parents owned land, about 400 acres north of Calvert Creek. Timber mostly, but there's water rights attached to it that are worth, I don't know exactly, but a lot. More than the land itself. She looked at her hands on the wheelchair's armrests. There was a man named Victor Hayes. He was our dad's business partner. When our parents died, Victor said he was our legal guardian. He had paperwork. Was he? No. The word came out flat and certain. My parents named someone else, my aunt. She lives in Billings. But Victor had paperwork that looked official, and he had a lawyer, and we were kids in a hospital, and nobody... She stopped again, pressed her lips together. Nobody asked us what we wanted. How long did you stay with him? 6 weeks? Her hands tightened on the armrests. He kept saying things were being processed, that we'd see our aunt soon. But we never went to Billings, and our aunt's calls stopped coming, and then one night I heard Victor on the phone. What did you hear? She looked up at him. That if we signed the land transfer, both of us, were both listed in the estate because my parents set it up that way to protect us. Then we'd be taken care of. That was the word he used, taken care of. But the way he said it, she held Adrian's gaze. I've heard that phrase before. I know what it means when someone says it that way. Adrian looked at her for a moment. 7 years old, he kept thinking. She was 7 years old and she had heard a man discussing what to do about 2 children who were inconvenient, and she had understood what she was hearing, and she had acted on it. You ran, he said. 3 days later. I waited until the housekeeper had her day off and Victor was in town. I packed what I could carry in Liam's backpack. I knew the trail north because my dad used to take me up there before my leg got bad. I thought if we could get to the Ridge Road, someone would pick us up. The Ridge Road's been closed since October. I know that now. How did the wheelchair get damaged? Her jaw worked for a moment. Victor's property manager caught up with us on the Calvert Creek access road. He grabbed the chair. I got it back. She didn't elaborate. He didn't push. So you've been out since 3 days ago. We slept in an equipment shed the first night. Yesterday we started up the ridge trail and the storm came in faster than I expected. She looked at the window again. I didn't know what else to do. I saw the smoke. Adrian sat with everything she'd said. He believed her. He'd spent years reading people in high-pressure situations, and she had the specific cadence of someone telling the truth. Not the smoothness of a rehearsed story, but the stops and starts and sideways movements of a person navigating actual memory. Victor knows about this cabin? He asked. He knows you're in this area. His man saw which direction we went on the trail. She paused. He won't stop. The land transfer has to happen before a court date in 11 days. If it doesn't, his whole legal position collapses. 11 days. Adrian processed that like a timeline, which was exactly what it was. All right, he said. He stood and went to the cook stove. I'm going to make breakfast. Then I'm going to go outside and check the perimeter. You're going to stay inside with Ghost. And then what? He poured water into the pan. Then we figure out the next step. That's not a plan. No, he agreed. It's a starting point. Liam woke up hungry and confused and decided, after approximately 30 seconds of orientation, that his situation was acceptable because Ghost was still there. He ate scrambled eggs with the focused intensity of a 4-year-old who has been very hungry for several days and is not going to waste the experience by talking. He gave Ghost a piece of toast when he thought Adrian wasn't looking. Adrian was looking. He let it go. Sophie ate less, which Adrian noticed. She was running on something tighter than hunger, a sustained alertness that burned through calories differently. He'd seen it in operators during sustained operations, the way the body recalibrated when the nervous system was running at a higher baseline. She was in a mode most adults never reached. She just didn't have the vocabulary for it. After breakfast, he geared up properly. Base layer, insulated shell, gator boots, the kind of preparation he did methodically without rushing, because rushing led to forgotten things, and forgotten things in cold weather led to consequences. He checked the handgun, put it in the hip holster under his shell, took his binoculars from the shelf, and looked at Sophie. I'll be 40 minutes. Keep the door locked. Don't open it for anyone. What if something happens to you? Ghost will know before you do. If he goes to alert, get yourself and Liam into the back corner of the bedroom, the one without a window. Stay low. I'll be back. She held his gaze. You sound like you've done this before. I've done a lot of things before. He went out. Well, the cold hit him clean and immediate, 12 degrees and dropping, with a wind chill that knocked it somewhere south of 0. The snow had accumulated another 4 inches overnight, bringing the total cover to about 18 inches in the open areas and significantly more where it had drifted against the tree line and the north face of the cabin. He did the perimeter in a widening spiral, starting at the cabin wall and working out to 200 meters on each side, moving with the particular economy of motion that years of field work build into the body. Not fast. Methodical. Eyes working the snow for any sign of passage, compressed footprints, disturbed brush, the subtle wrongness of something placed or positioned. He found the first set of tracks 40 meters east of the tree line. 2 men. Larger boots, 1 set, maybe size 12, deep heel impact suggesting significant body weight, roughly 200 plus pounds. The second set was smaller, faster, the stride pattern of someone who moved professionally, weight on the balls of the feet. These tracks came in from the north, circled to the tree line edge, and went back north. They'd come at approximately 2 in the morning based on how much snow had accumulated in the impressions, maybe 4 inches, which matched the overnight accumulation timeline he'd been tracking. He photographed the tracks with the small digital camera he kept in his shell pocket, the one he'd started carrying again out of old habit about 6 months into living here, after he'd found signs of activity on the property that turned out to be nothing concerning, but that had reminded him not to trust his memory alone. He photographed them from 3 angles, noting the stride length and depth for later assessment, and then continued the circuit. On the south side of the cabin, near the access trail, he found something else. A cigarette butt, half covered by snow but still visible. Not his. He didn't smoke. Fresh enough to have been dropped in the last 12 hours. Filterless, which was a detail, something specific. He flagged the location mentally and continued. By the time he finished the full circuit, he had a preliminary picture. 2 individuals skilled enough to move quietly in wilderness terrain at night, professional enough to maintain observation discipline, but sloppy enough to leave a cigarette butt. Not military. Military would not have left that. Private contractors, probably, or hunting guides working a side job, the kind of hired capability you could pick up cheaply in rural Montana if you knew who to call and how much cash you were waving around. Victor Hayes had resources. Not sophisticated ones, but sufficient. He went back inside. Sophie was at the table with Liam's backpack open in front of her, going through it with the systematic attention of someone taking inventory. She'd pulled out 2 changes of children's clothes, a bag of crackers, a water bottle, a small stuffed rabbit with one ear that was clearly Liam's, and a folded piece of paper that she quickly covered with her hand when Adrian came in. He saw her cover it. He didn't say anything about it. 2 men, he said, pulling his gloves off. They circled the tree line last night and went back north. They're not military, but they're not nothing either. Victor has money, she said. He's been paying people for months. Tell me about the legal situation. The paperwork he has." She hesitated. Then she unfolded the piece of paper she'd covered and pushed it across the table. It was a photocopy, worn along the folds, the kind of document that had been folded and unfolded many times, of what appeared to be a guardianship declaration. Victor Hayes' name was on it. The signatures at the bottom were her parents' names. Adrian looked at it carefully. He wasn't a lawyer, and he knew that, but he'd spent enough time dealing with documentation and operational contexts to understand the structure of official paperwork. He noted 3 things. The notary seal was from a county that didn't match the address listed in the document. The date was 3 weeks before the accident that killed Sophie's parents. And the signature on the right, her mother's name, had a quality to it he'd seen before in documents that had been assisted. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "I found it in his office while he was out." She watched him look at it. "It's fake, isn't it?" "I'm not qualified to make that call." "But you think it is?" He set it back on the table. "I think it needs to be looked at by someone who is qualified." He sat down. "Your aunt in Billings. Does she know where you are?" "I couldn't call her. Victor had our phones." "Do you know her number?" Sophie closed her eyes for 4 seconds. Then she recited a 10-digit number without hesitation. He looked at her. "I memorized it," she said. "Before we left. I knew we might need it." He'd had operators on his teams who hadn't shown that kind of pre-operational thinking. He reached across to the shelf behind him and picked up the satellite phone. Not his cell, which had limited range up here and was potentially traceable to a tower that could be queried, and held it out to her. She took it and dialed. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Sophie's face didn't change. "Aunt Carol, it's Sophie. We're okay. Liam's okay. We're somewhere safe. I can't say where. Please call the sheriff's office in Ridgecrest County and tell them about Victor Hayes. Tell them everything." She paused, and for the first time something that was not composure moved across her face. Something younger, something that was still a child underneath all the rest of it. "We miss you. We're okay." She ended the call. She handed the phone back to Adrian and looked at the table. He didn't say anything for a moment. "You did good," he said. "It might not work." "Might not," he agreed. "But we try everything we can try. That's how it works." She looked up at him. There was a question in her expression. Not the logistical kind, something else. The kind of question people asked with their eyes when they wanted to know whether they could trust what they were being told, or whether this was just another version of someone managing them toward a particular outcome. He didn't look away. He let her read him as well as she could. She looked back at the table. She didn't say anything. But something in her posture changed, very slightly, the way a cable under tension changes when you release 1 degree of load from it. Sad. The rest of that morning passed in the particular suspended quality of waiting that Adrian recognized from operations. The hours between the briefing and the insertion, when there was nothing to do but maintain readiness and try not to let the mind run ahead of the available information. He taught Liam how to play a card game involving sorting by color, which required no particular skill and could be played on the floor with Ghost as an interested observer. The boy had an instinct for simple games. He focused completely, which was a quality Adrian had noticed and filed away. Sophie sat with the folded document for a while, then put it back in the backpack. She watched Adrian with Liam from across the room, and he could feel her watching but didn't perform anything for the attention. He just played the card game. At 11:30, his satellite phone rang. He answered it. The woman's voice on the other end was tight with controlled fear and anger, the specific frequency of an adult who has been managing terror for months and has just been handed something real to grab onto. "This is Carol Mercer. Who is this?" "My name is Adrian Cole. I have your niece and nephew. They're safe." A sound on the other end that was not quite a word. "Sophie called you. She's sitting right here." He held the phone out. Sophie took it. The conversation that followed was the first moment he'd seen her composure crack. Not fully, not into tears, but into the specific unsteadiness of a child who has been holding everything together through will alone and has just heard a voice that means she doesn't have to anymore. Her voice got smaller. She said yes 3 times and I know twice, and then, "We saw smoke from the chimney. He let us in." She listened. "I know," she said again. "We're okay, I promise." She handed the phone back to Adrian. Carol Mercer's voice was steadier now. She'd gotten her footing. She said, "You're a soldier. Retired. Can you keep them safe? Because I need to know that, genuinely, before I tell you what I know about Victor Hayes, because once I start talking, there's no, I can keep them safe, Adrian said. A pause. He's been bribing 2 people in the county clerk's office to delay the estate filing. My attorney found that out 3 days ago. We were going to court Monday to get an emergency injunction, but then Sophie and Liam went missing and I've been, her voice broke, reassembled. I've had private investigators looking for them for 48 hours. Who else knows you hired investigators? My attorney and the agency. Keep it that way. Don't call local law enforcement yet. He said this with deliberation, because he didn't know yet what Victor Hayes had bought locally, and he wasn't going to assume he hadn't bought anything. Give me 24 hours. Why 24 hours? Because I need to know what I'm working with before I start making calls that can't be unmade. She didn't like it. He could hear that. But she was smart enough to follow the logic. 24 hours, she said. Then I'm calling everyone. That's fair. He ended the call. Sophie was watching him. She's okay, he said. She's been looking for you. Sophie nodded slowly. Something in her eyes changed. Not relief exactly, but the confirmation of something she'd been needing, confirmed for a long time. That someone who was supposed to care was still caring. Liam had stopped sorting cards and was watching them both with the careful attention of a child who can't follow the words but reads the room perfectly. Is Aunt Carol coming? He asked. Working on it, Adrian said. Okay. Liam went back to his cards. Ghost, who had been lying near the wood stove, raised his head. Adrian felt it before he understood it. A change in the air, a difference in quality, the particular shift that happens when a well-trained dog goes from resting to alert without visible transition. Ghost's ears came forward. His eyes went to the door. Then Adrian heard it. An engine. Not the groan of a vehicle struggling up an icy mountain road, which was the sound he would have expected and which would have given him 2 or 3 minutes of preparation time. This was the sound of a vehicle that had already arrived, already stopped, the engine idling at low RPM in the way of something that had been driven deliberately and parked deliberately, out of earshot of the cabin until the driver decided to let it be heard. A move designed to compress response time. Someone who understood the value of announcement. Adrian stood. Bedroom, he said. Both of you, now. Liam looked up, startled by the tone. Sophie was already moving. Ghost, Adrian said, with them. Ghost moved immediately to flank the wheelchair as Sophie propelled herself toward the bedroom. Adrian had the door open for them in 3 strides, and they were through it, and he pulled it most of the way closed. He went to the north window without turning on any lights, and stood to the side of the glass, looking out. A black SUV was parked at the end of the access trail, 50 meters from the cabin. A man was standing in front of it, and he was walking toward the door. The man walking toward the cabin was not one of the 2 from the tree line. Adrian registered that immediately. Wrong build, wrong gait, wrong posture entirely. The 2 from last night had moved like working men, functional and purposeful. This one moved like someone who had spent his professional life in rooms where other people did the physical work for him. Medium height, broad across the shoulders but soft in the middle, wearing a wool overcoat that cost more than everything Adrian owned that wasn't a firearm. He walked with his hands visible, slightly away from his body, which was either a sign of good sense or a practiced performance of good sense, and Adrian wasn't yet certain which. Behind the SUV, just visible at the vehicle's rear quarter panel, a second figure stood without moving. That one was not showing his hands. Adrian did a fast mental inventory of the cabin's geometry. Front door facing south, the direction the man was approaching from. North window, east window, 1 small bathroom window on the west side, too narrow for entry. The bedroom where Sophie and Liam and Ghost were positioned had the east window, which faced the tree line where the tracks had been last night. He didn't love that. He didn't love any of this, but he particularly didn't love that. He moved to the door, not to open it, to position himself beside it, back against the wall at the hinge side, the way you stood when you didn't know what was coming through. He could hear the man's boots on the porch steps now, the particular compression of new snow under weight. A knock. 3 times. Not aggressive. Measured, almost courteous. Adrian waited. Another knock. Mr. Cole. My name is Victor Hayes. I know the children are here. I'd like to speak with you peacefully. The voice was everything Sophie had described without describing. Smooth on the surface, the careful diction of a man who had trained himself to project reasonableness. A negotiator's voice. A man who had learned that the right tone bought him more than aggression in most situations. Adrian had met this type before, in different clothes, different contexts, different countries. The manner varied. The fundamental calculus never did. He opened the door. Victor Hayes was standing on the porch with his hands still at his sides, a controlled half-smile that had clearly been deployed many times before. Up close, he was maybe 50, with the kind of face that photographs well and trusts that it does. His eyes were doing a fast professional assessment of Adrian, the door frame, the room behind him, the absence of the children, and the eyes were where the performance broke down, because they were cold in a way that the smile was working hard to compensate for. "Mr. Cole," Victor said, like they were being introduced at a function. "You drove up a closed road," Adrian said. "The snow allowed it, barely." A small, self-deprecating gesture. "I was worried about the children. She has medical needs. I'm responsible for her care." "She told me who you are." Something moved through Victor's expression, slight, controlled. "Children sometimes?" "Don't," Adrian said. Victor stopped. "Don't give me the thing about children and their imagination or children misunderstanding adult situations. I've sat across from professionals who are better at this than you are, and I don't have the patience for it this morning." Adrian kept his voice even, not aggressive, factual. "Tell me what you actually want." Victor looked at him for a moment. The half-smile had flattened out. He was recalibrating. "I want the children returned to my care. They are my legal wards. I have documentation, dated 3 weeks before your partner's car accident, notarized by a county that doesn't correspond to the address in the filing, and the signature on the mother's line." Adrian paused for exactly long enough. "Looks like it had help." The silence that followed had a different texture than the silence before it. Victor's expression did not collapse. He had too much practice control for that, but it rearranged itself. The warmth went out of it entirely, and what was underneath was something much more straightforward. "You've been busy," he said. "I've had time to look at things." "Mr. Cole." The voice dropped the courtesy now, just slightly, like a man who has decided the register of conversation has changed. "I don't know what those children told you, but I know what this situation is. 2 kids, no parents, property, sitting in a legal gray zone. You're a retired soldier living alone on a mountain. Whatever story Sophie told you, consider who benefits from you believing it." "She benefits," Adrian said, "and her brother." "My attorney is going to have a complicated week." Adrian held the door frame with one hand, not blocking the entrance, but his body in the space. "Here's where we are. The children are inside. They're warm and fed, and they're going to stay that way. You're on my property, which is posted, which means your presence right now is trespass. The man behind your vehicle is also trespassing." He looked past Victor to where the second figure was still standing. "You can leave, or I can make some calls." Victor watched him. "You're making a serious mistake." "Probably," Adrian agreed. "I make them sometimes. I have legal standing. You have a piece of paper. Legal standing is something a judge determines." Adrian looked at him steadily. "Go. Take your man with you. Come back with a court order and a county sheriff, and I will open this door and we will do everything by the process. That's my offer." Victor held his gaze for 5 seconds. Adrian counted them. "You have no idea what you're involving yourself in," Victor said. "I'm involved," Adrian said. "That part's done." Victor turned and walked back down the porch steps. He walked to the SUV at the same measured pace he'd arrived with, and the second figure moved around to the passenger side, and Adrian watched both of them without moving from the doorframe until the SUV's engine note changed and it began to reverse down the access trail. He watched until it was gone. Then he stood there for another 30 seconds, watching the trail. Then he closed the door and locked it. He gave himself 45 seconds to run his pulse back down from wherever it had gone, standing with his back against the door and his hands loose at his sides. Not because anything he'd done had been particularly taxing, but because adrenaline was adrenaline and pretending otherwise was how you made decisions you regretted. He'd expected to feel more. He'd expected the particular static that used to come up behind his eyes in high-pressure situations, the noise that had been getting louder in the years since he'd left the Navy, the reason he'd come up here in the first place. It wasn't there. He noticed its absence the way you notice a sound has stopped. He went to the bedroom door. Clear, he said. Ghost appeared first, always, because that was how Ghost operated. Then Liam's face around the edge of the door, wide-eyed. Then Sophie, in the wheelchair, positioning herself to see past the dog. He's gone? She asked. For now. But he's coming back. Yes. Adrian didn't insult her by softening it. He's coming back, and when he does, he's going to come differently. He came today to assess what he was dealing with. He knows now. What does he know? That I'm not going to be talked out of it. Adrian looked at her, which means he's going to stop trying to talk. Sophie processed that quickly. He could see it, the short calculation, the arrival at the same point he'd already reached. When? She asked. Tonight. Tomorrow morning, at the latest. The court date he's working against is 11 days out. He can't afford to wait. Liam had gone to Ghost and was holding the dog's collar with both hands, which was a thing he did when he was scared but was trying not to show it because his sister wasn't showing it. Adrian noticed that, the way the boy read his sister and calibrated his own response to match hers. 4 years old and already doing that. Can we call the sheriff now? Sophie asked. Not yet. He looked at her carefully. Victor mentioned having contacts. I don't know what that means locally, but until I do, involving county law enforcement is a risk I'm not ready to take. Your aunt's attorney is the safer path. I need to call him directly. He's a she, Diane Kessel, Kessel Law in Billings. He looked at her. You know your aunt's attorney's name. I looked at the paperwork before we left. He took the satellite phone from the shelf. Diane Kessel answered on the second ring, which told him she'd been waiting for calls. She was efficient and direct, no preamble, no wasted words, and when he laid out the situation in the flat, factual sequence he'd developed for briefings, she absorbed it the same way. He came to the property, she said when he finished. Yes. That's actually helpful. Her voice had a quality he recognized, someone doing fast legal calculation, turning the event into an instrument. It establishes awareness of the children's location and a direct attempt to recover them outside legal process. Do you have any documentation of the visit? He thought about the satellite phone's call log, Victor's statement on the porch, the tracks from last night. I can build something. The forged guardianship document. Do you have the original copy? A photocopy. Get me a photograph of it, every detail, the notary seal, the dates, the signatures. He heard her writing. I have a contact at the Montana Secretary of State's office who can run the notary registration tonight. If that seal is invalid or out of county, we can have it flagged as fraudulent by morning. Victor has someone in the county clerk's office. Which county? That I don't know yet. I'll start with Ridgecrest and go from there. Mr. Cole. Her voice shifted, still efficient but grounded now in something more direct. These children have been missing for 3 days. The moment I hang up, I'm filing an emergency motion with the district court in Billings for a custody suspension order against Hayes. That gets a judge involved tonight. How long does that take to execute? To file? An hour. To serve? However long it takes to find a marshal willing to drive up a mountain in a blizzard. Could be this evening, could be tomorrow. Plan for tomorrow, he said, and assume Victor will move before then. I'll make some calls, she said. Keep those children safe. He ended the call. Sophie had been listening. She'd made no pretense of not listening. She sounds like she knows what she's doing, she said. She does. Is that enough? Adrian sat down across from her. He thought about how to answer that honestly. It's the right kind of help for the right part of the problem. The legal piece needs lawyers. The part between now and when the lawyers arrive. He looked at the door. That part's mine. Sophie was quiet for a moment, then, why are you doing this? He'd known the question was coming. He'd been aware of it circling since last night, since she'd first asked, and he'd deflected with the soup and the first aid kit and the window checks. He looked at her now. Someone should have, he said. Simple. True. Not the whole truth, but the part of the truth that was hers to hear. She held his gaze. That doesn't really answer it. No, he agreed. It doesn't. Well, he spent the next 3 hours building what he thought of privately as a defensive posture, using the materials and the terrain he had. It was not a dramatic process. It was the unglamorous, methodical work of preparation, the kind that determined outcomes in the field, and that nobody ever talked about afterward because it didn't make for good stories. He repositioned the firearm. The .45 stayed on his hip now, concealed but accessible. He found his old go bag in the back of the gear closet, the one he'd packed 11 months ago and not touched since, and confirmed its contents: 2 days of compact rations, a trauma kit, emergency thermal blankets, a backup radio, extra ammunition, and a laminated card with the emergency frequencies for Ridgecrest County Search and Rescue, which was not law enforcement and which could not be compromised by Victor's county clerk contacts. He thought carefully about that radio. If things escalated to a point where shots were fired or anyone was hurt, the call didn't go to the sheriff's dispatch. It went to Search and Rescue, who would bring enough people and enough attention that whatever Victor was trying to manage quietly would stop being quiet. That was an option, not a preferred one, but an option. He photographed the guardianship document from 4 angles, texted the images to Diane Kessel's number, and received 3 words back: "Got it. Working." He checked the access trail camera, a small motion-activated unit he'd mounted in a spruce tree 40 meters down the trail, one of 2 he'd installed the previous spring after finding signs of trespassing he'd never fully explained. The camera's image showed the SUV's tire tracks, clear and distinct in the snow, heading north. It also showed, if you looked at the tree line on the eastern edge, a single boot print that hadn't been there during his morning sweep. Someone had stayed behind. Adrian looked at that image for a long time. Victor had left, but Victor had also left a watcher, which meant Victor had resources he was comfortable losing or comfortable deploying as a tripwire while he went to regroup and make decisions. A watcher in the trees wasn't a threat yet. A watcher was information gathering, and information gathering meant Victor wasn't sure what he had yet, which meant Victor was not as confident as he tried to project on the porch. That was something. He told Sophie they would eat an early dinner, and she didn't ask why. She'd been watching him move through the preparations with the same quiet attention she'd given him all day, not in the way of someone waiting to be protected, but in the way of someone taking notes. He made chili from canned goods, plain and caloric and fast, and they ate around the table at 4 in the afternoon while the light outside went from gray to gray-blue and the temperature dropped another 6 degrees. Liam told Ghost a detailed story about a rabbit he'd met once in a park somewhere that Ghost listened to with apparent interest. Adrian and Sophie ate without speaking for a while, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable, which was the thing that surprised him when he noticed it. He was not good at companionable silence with anyone who wasn't Ghost. He'd forgotten what it felt like. "You were in how long?" Sophie asked between bites. He looked at her. 11 years. Did you like it? That was not the question people usually asked. They asked if it was hard or if he'd seen bad things or whether he was glad to be out. Nobody had asked him if he liked it. "Some of it," he said. "The part where you protected people?" He considered that. "Yes." "But something happened." Not a question. He looked at her across the table. "Yes." "You don't have to tell me," she said, and went back to her chili. The thing was, he found himself wanting to. That surprised him too. He'd spent the better part of 2 years not wanting to tell anyone anything, not because the events themselves were classified, most of them weren't, but because language had started to feel inadequate for them, and inadequate language felt worse than no language at all. "I lost people," he said, "on a mission that went wrong. 3 of my team." He looked at his bowl. "I was the team leader." "Was it your fault?" "No." He said it clearly, because it was what his debrief had concluded, what the investigation had concluded, what every rational part of his mind that he could access had concluded. But it doesn't work that way. When you're in charge and people under you die, the fault question becomes... He stopped. It becomes something else. Sophie was quiet for a moment. "Like when I couldn't carry Liam when my leg gave out on the trail yesterday," she said. "He was freezing and I couldn't carry him and I had to drag him on my lap for half a mile and I kept thinking if he dies, it's my fault, even though it wasn't," Adrian said. "Even though it wasn't," she agreed. They looked at each other. 4-year-old Liam was telling Ghost about the rabbit's preferred diet, and the dog was very engaged in this. Full dark came at 6:15 and Adrian was ready for it. He'd killed the exterior light, not unusual, he sometimes left it off anyway, and positioned himself at the north window with the cabin's interior lights reduced to a single lamp on the far wall, which put him in shadow and made the window a dark surface from outside rather than a lit frame. Ghost was on the bedroom floor beside the children, which was where Adrian had asked him to be. And Ghost had looked at him when he said it with the particular expression of a dog who understood the assignment but wanted it registered that he didn't entirely like it. Sophie had asked, before he put them in the bedroom, whether she should barricade the door. He told her no. A barricaded door created noise and delay when he needed to move through it. She'd accepted that without argument, which told him she understood tactics even if she'd never had the vocabulary for them. He'd given her the satellite phone and Diane Kessel's number written on a piece of paper, and he'd told her, if you hear more than one voice or hear the sound of the exterior door coming in hard, you call 911. Not Kessel. 911. Don't wait. She'd memorized the number before he finished saying it. He stood at the north window in the dark and watched. At 8:47, the motion camera at the access trail sent a vibration to the small receiver he'd clipped to his belt. Movement on the trail, which could be an animal, but given the evening and what he knew about the watcher in the trees, probably wasn't. He moved to the east window to check the tree line. 2 shapes at the tree line this time. His jaw tightened. Victor had come back with the 2 from last night. He watched them for 30 seconds, tracking their movement. Not toward the front door this time, not the polite knock approach. They were moving laterally along the tree line, one splitting north toward the access trail side of the cabin, the other holding the east position. Flanking geometry. Splitting the defender's attention and forcing a response to multiple approach vectors simultaneously. The thing about flanking geometry was that it only worked if the defender had to cover all positions. If the defender could collapse to a single defensible point, the flanking became irrelevant. Adrian was already moving. He went to the bedroom. "We're switching," he said quietly. Sophie looked at him. He took the go bag from the closet and pulled out the backup radio. Checked the frequency. "You, Liam, and Ghost are going to the back of the main room, behind the table. I need the bedroom." "Why?" "The approach is from the east. I need the east window, and I need you away from it." He looked at Liam, who had woken up and was looking at him with big, watchful eyes. "Liam, come here." The boy came to him immediately. Adrian crouched in front of him. "I need you to be very quiet for a little while. Like a very quiet rabbit." Liam thought about this seriously. "Like the rabbit in the park?" "Exactly like that rabbit." Adrian held the boy's gaze. "Can you do that for me?" Liam nodded, solemn. "Good man." Adrian stood. "Sophie, move." She moved. He helped her get the wheelchair through the bedroom door and around to the back wall of the main room, the interior wall, the one with no windows, and the wood stove between her and the door. He positioned the table as additional mass between her position and the front entrance. It wasn't cover, but it was concealment. And in a low-light situation, concealment was worth something. Ghost stationed himself beside the wheelchair without being told. Adrian went back to the bedroom. He did not turn on any lights. He positioned himself against the wall beside the east window, far enough from the glass not to be visible, close enough to see the tree line at an angle. The shape was still there, still moving laterally, slower now, getting to a position. His phone, the satellite unit, vibrated in his pocket. He answered without speaking, just held it to his ear. Diane Kessel's voice, fast and tight. "I got the notary confirmation. The seal on that document is from a notary whose license expired 14 months ago. I filed the fraud claim with the court, and I have a judge reviewing the emergency motion right now." She paused. "How bad is it up there?" "Working on it," he said quietly. "There's something else." A beat. Victor Hayes has a prior. A civil fraud case in Wyoming, 8 years ago. He settled it, but the plaintiff was a minor child, a ward he was managing. Same pattern. "Forward everything to this number," Adrian said. He ended the call. The shape at the tree line stopped moving. Adrian watched. For 40 seconds, nothing moved. The shapes at the tree line were in position. The north side shape had gone still too, which meant they were coordinated, which meant there was communication between them, radio or phone, and they were waiting for a signal. The signal, when it came, was not anything sophisticated. It was a car's horn. 2 short bursts. Victor's SUV, somewhere down the access trail beyond camera range. Both shapes moved simultaneously. Adrian brought the 10 bam 45 up, not to fire. Not yet. Not through a window, at shapes he couldn't fully identify at this range. not with children 15 feet behind him, but to have it in hand for the moment it became necessary. He tracked the east shape as it cleared the tree line, moving across the open snow toward the cabin's east wall. Compact movement. Experienced. The figure was carrying something low at his right side, and when it caught the ambient light from the sky, Adrian identified the object's silhouette. A bolt cutter. Going for the generator housing, he thought first, then corrected himself immediately. The generator was on the south side. The east wall had one thing of value, the external electrical panel. Cut that and the cabin went dark. Motion sensors, the trail camera receiver, the small alarm contact he'd put on the front door 6 months ago, all of it went offline. He was trying to go dark before entry. Adrian moved. He came out of the bedroom fast, crossed the main room in 4 steps, and hit the manual breaker switch on the interior fuse panel beside the kitchen, killed everything himself before they could. The cabin went pitch black. He heard Sophie's sharp intake of breath from behind the table and said quietly, precisely, "Stay." Then he went to the front door. He didn't open it. He put his back to the wall beside it, the hinge side, 45 in his right hand, and waited. Outside, boots on the porch steps. 2 sets. Front approach, which meant the east side man had circled faster than expected. A voice, low, aimed at the door. "Cole, we just want the kids. Open the door and walk away. Nobody needs to make this bigger than it is." Adrian recognized the voice, not from their previous meeting, but from the type. This was the property manager Sophie had described, the one who'd grabbed the wheelchair on the Calvert Creek Road. Ghost, from behind the table, produced a sound that was not a bark. It was lower than that, more fundamental, the sound a dog makes from the chest when it has identified a threat and is choosing to contain its response out of discipline rather than instinct. The voice outside didn't continue. Then the door handle moved, slow, testing, feeling the lock. Adrian had 1 second to make the decision he'd been preparing for since 2 in the morning. He made it. He unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door. The man on the other side had approximately 1 second to register that the door was opening from the inside and that the person opening it was not doing so in submission. Before Adrian's left hand came up and took the man's coat collar, and his right shoulder rotated forward, and the man's forward momentum combined with a precise redirection of his own weight, took him off the porch and face first into the snow beside the steps, with enough controlled force to knock the air out of him without doing the kind of damage that caused paperwork. It happened in under 2 seconds. The second man at the porch step was younger and faster and managed to get his hands up before Adrian reached him, which suggested some training, and they made contact. 3 seconds of real contact, the ugly, non-cinematic kind of contact that happens when 2 people who know what they're doing are in a small space and neither of them has room to do anything clean. Adrian took an elbow across the left cheekbone that he would feel for a week. He gave back a wrist lock that hyperextended the joint with a controlled, specific application of leverage, and the young man's face went white, and his body followed the direction of least pain, which was down. Adrian stepped back. Both men were on the porch and the snow in front of it, one prone and winded, one sitting with his wrist cradled against his chest, both staring up at him with the particular expression of people who had been told this would be simple and are revising their understanding rapidly. He was breathing hard. His cheek was already swelling. "Where is Hayes?" he said. Neither of them answered. "I photographed your boot prints from last night," Adrian said. His voice was steady, in the way a voice gets steady when it's running on something past adrenaline, something quieter and more dangerous. "I have your tire tracks on camera. I have a fraud filing in district court in Billings and an attorney who has been building this case for 3 hours. You're past the point where walking away doesn't have consequences. So I am going to ask you one more time where Hayes is." The younger one, cradling his wrist, looked toward the access trail. Involuntary. He tried to correct it, but he'd already done it. Adrian looked at the trail. Headlights were on the access trail, stationary. A vehicle parked far enough back that it hadn't triggered the camera. Victor's SUV. He looked back at the 2 men on the porch. "Stay here," he said. "Don't move." He went back inside, closed the door, and went directly to the table where Ghost and Sophie and Liam were in the dark. He crouched beside the wheelchair. "Are you hurt?" Sophie's voice was very controlled. "No." His cheek was saying otherwise, but that wasn't relevant. "I need the phone." She handed it to him. He dialed Diane Kessel. She answered in one ring. "I need the marshal," he said. "Tonight, not tomorrow." "What happened?" "I have two of Hayes's men on my porch. Hayes is on the access trail in a vehicle. The emergency motion, wherever it is right now, I need it served tonight." A pause that was her calculating, not hesitating. "I'll call the marshal's office right now. Get me a GPS coordinate." He gave her the coordinates from the cabin's location tag. "Adrian." First time she'd used his first name. "The judge signed the motion 40 minutes ago. Victor Hayes is in contempt from the moment he was on your property. The warrant for his arrest is being processed. What I need is someone to physically hand it to him." "How long?" "An hour, maybe 90 minutes. He looked at the door. "Understood," he said. He ended the call and stood and looked down at Sophie in the dark. Liam was pressed against Ghost's side, the stuffed rabbit held against his chest. Ghost was still in position, still holding, doing what he did. "1 hour," Adrian said. Sophie looked up at him. Her face was very still in the dark, and her eyes were the same as they'd been on the porch the first night. The eyes that had calculated something and reached a conclusion and were not going to pretend otherwise. "Okay," she said. Outside on the porch, one of the men had started to move. Adrian went back to the door. The man who'd been moving on the porch stopped moving the moment Adrian opened the door again. It wasn't the gun that stopped him. Adrian hadn't raised it. It was something else. Something in the way Adrian filled the doorframe and looked at him with the specific, unhurried attention of a person who has already decided what happens next and is simply waiting for the other party to catch up. The man, the winded one, the heavier one, the one whose face had met the snow, was up on one knee with his palms flat on the porch boards, and he looked up at Adrian and made the calculation that people made when they stopped trying. "Sit," Adrian said. The man sat, fully. Back against the porch railing, hands visible. The younger one with the wrist was already sitting. He hadn't moved since Adrian put him down. His face had the particular closed-off quality of someone managing significant pain and trying to look like he wasn't. Adrian stood in the doorway and watched the access trail. The SUV's headlights were still there, stationary. Victor wasn't moving. Victor was waiting, for his men to report in probably, and the silence from the porch was telling him something he didn't want to hear. 4 minutes passed. Then the headlights moved. Not away. Forward. The SUV came up the access trail slowly, stopping 20 meters from the cabin. The engine idled. The driver's door opened and Victor Hayes stepped out into the snow. He looked at his two men on the porch. He looked at Adrian in the doorway. The practiced composure was gone, not collapsed into panic, but stripped back to something more functional and considerably less pleasant. He looked finally like what he was. "This is assault," Victor said. "You put hands on both of these men. They were on my property," Adrian said, "at night, attempting to disable my electrical system." He kept his voice level. "Your man had a bolt cutter." Victor looked at the younger man, who looked away. "I want to see the children," Victor said. "You're not going to." "I have legal guardianship. You have a forged document." Adrian watched Victor's face when he said it, the specific micro-expression of a man whose position has just been accurately named. "The notary seal on your guardianship filing is from a license that expired 14 months ago. That was confirmed 2 hours ago by the Montana Secretary of State's office. Your attorney filed that document knowing it was invalid. That's fraud, Mr. Hayes. Not civil. Criminal." Victor stood in the snow and said nothing. "There's an emergency custody suspension order signed by a district court judge in Billings. A federal marshal is on the way up this road right now." Adrian looked at his watch, not to check the time, but to give Victor a concrete sense of how much of it was left. "You have maybe 40 minutes to decide what you want the next part of this to look like." "You are a retired soldier living on a mountain," Victor said. His voice had gone quiet. Not calm. Quiet. The way things go quiet when the pressure behind them is very high. "You have no standing here, no legal role, no authority." "I have a porch," Adrian said, "and 2 people sitting on it who work for you. That's enough standing for tonight." Victor looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the cabin, at the dark windows, at the chimney smoke, at the door, and something moved through his expression that was as close to calculation as anything Adrian had seen from him. He was running numbers. I was figuring out which version of tonight was survivable and which wasn't. The land is worth $9 million, Victor said. Just like that, flat, like a man laying a card on the table. Water rights attached, timber. The valuation was done 6 months ago. My attorney's fee alone is... He stopped. I'm not a monster. I've been managing a legitimate business interest. Against 2 children who lost their parents, Adrian said. Victor's jaw tightened. $9 million, Adrian said. And you put 2 men outside a cabin in a blizzard to get to a 7-year-old girl and her 4-year-old brother. The silence that followed had weight to it. Victor Hayes did not respond. He walked back to his SUV, got in, and sat there. The marshal arrived at 11:43. 2 vehicles, a federal marshal's truck and a Ridgecrest County Sheriff's cruiser that, Adrian noted, bore the markings of the county's search and rescue division rather than standard law enforcement. Diane Kessel had been careful about which arm of local authority she'd called, and he appreciated that. The marshal was a woman in her 50s named Hartley, who moved with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who had driven 90 minutes through a Montana winter on short notice and was going to handle this correctly regardless of how inconvenient it was. She read Victor Hayes the suspension order and the fraud warrant in the lights of her truck, while Victor stood in the snow with his hands in his overcoat pockets and his face gone completely blank. He didn't resist. He was too smart for that. He submitted to the handcuffing with the contained, furious dignity of a man who is already running his next play in his head, which was probably the first conversation with a very expensive defense attorney. The 2 men from the porch were detained separately, which Adrian appreciated for the tactical cleanliness of it. The younger one, the one with the wrist, had it looked at by the SAR EMT who'd come in the second vehicle, and the verdict was a partial sprain, not a break, which Adrian had been fairly confident about but was glad to have confirmed. Marshal Hartley came to the cabin door afterward. "You're Cole," she said. "Yes." She looked at his face, the cheekbone, which had gone from swollen to impressively discolored in the past 2 hours. "You get that checked." "I will." "The children are inside?" "Yes." She looked at him steadily. She had the kind of face that had spent decades reading people in adverse situations and had stopped performing neutrality about it. "I need to see them, briefly, to confirm welfare." "Of course." He stepped back and let her in. Sophie was at the table. Liam was asleep on the folded blanket beside Ghost, having fought it as long as he could and then surrendered completely. He slept the way he always slept, boneless, total, trusting. Marshal Hartley looked at Sophie, and Sophie looked back at her. "Sophie Mercer?" Hartley said. "Yes." "I'm going to ask you 3 questions. You can answer them however you want." Hartley sat across from her without being invited, which was a deliberate move, bringing herself to eye level. "Were you harmed while in the care of Victor Hayes?" Sophie was quiet for a moment. "Not physically." Hartley noted that. "Were you brought to this cabin voluntarily?" "Yes, I asked to come in." Sophie glanced at Adrian. "He didn't know we were coming." "And are you safe here?" Sophie considered the question with a seriousness that made Hartley pause slightly. "Yes," she said. "I'm safe here." Hartley looked at Adrian for a moment, then back at Sophie. "Your aunt is on her way from Billings. She'll be here by morning." She stood. "I'll need a statement from you both tomorrow, not tonight." "Okay," Sophie said. Hartley walked back to the door, paused with her hand on the frame. She looked at Adrian. "Kessel's attorney sent me your file." He kept his expression neutral. "There's a file. Medal of Valor recipient, 3 combat deployments, honorable discharge." She looked at the bruise on his face. 2 hostiles neutralized on the porch without a firearm discharge. They were trespassing. They were. She held his gaze. "Good night, Mr. Cole." She went out. The cabin was quiet for a long time after the vehicles left. Adrian sat in the chair by the door, the same chair he'd been in most of the night before, and listened to the settlement sounds of the structure around him and the diminished wind outside, and Liam's even breathing from the floor. His cheek was producing a dull, persistent complaint that he was managing by ignoring it. Sophie was still at the table. She hadn't gone to bed, and he hadn't suggested it, because she was clearly not going to, and they were both past the point where the performance of normal bedtime routines served any purpose. "I heard what she said," Sophie said eventually. "The medal thing." I heard you listening. Medal of Valor is a big deal. It's a piece of metal. She looked at him. For what? He was quiet for a moment. The wood stove ticked. Extracting a team that was pinned down. 2 buildings, bad geometry, limited visibility, 1 working radio between 4 of us. He looked at his hands. I got 2 of them out. The third one? He stopped. Didn't make it in time. That's the one you carry, Sophie said. He looked at her. She looked back at him steadily. You said you lost 3, but the way you said it then, the way you stopped, that's the one. Adrian didn't answer immediately. The accuracy of it, the casual, unsparing accuracy of a 7-year-old who read people the way other children read picture books, sat in the room between them. His name was Danny Reeves, Adrian said, from Beaumont, Texas. He had a daughter. He paused. She was 4 when he died. Sophie was quiet. That's why you kept looking at Liam, she said. Adrian hadn't known that consciously until she said it. He turned it over once, found it was true, and didn't respond. You should tell someone that, Sophie said. Not me. Someone who can actually help. He almost laughed. Almost. You're telling me to go to therapy. I'm telling you that carrying that alone is making you weird and isolated and you live on a mountain with a dog. She said it without any particular emphasis. Matter of fact. That's not normal. I'm aware. Okay. She folded her hands on the table. I just wanted to say it. He looked at her for a long moment. How old are you? 7? Right. What? Carol Mercer arrived at 6:48 in the morning, which meant she'd driven through the night. She was a compact woman in her mid-40s with Sophie's eyes, or Sophie had her eyes, and she came through the cabin door and crossed to her niece in 4 steps and put her arms around her and held on. And Sophie, who had not cried once in the approximately 36 hours Adrian had known her, put her face against her aunt's shoulder and made a sound that was very small and very old and entirely private, and Adrian took Ghost and went outside. He stood on the porch in the cold morning and looked at the access trail, at the tire tracks from last night's vehicles, at the cabin's shadow long on the snow in the early light. His breath came in even clouds. Ghost sat beside him. He stayed out there for 20 minutes. When he went back in, Liam was awake and had attached himself to Carol Mercer's side with the immediate, uncomplicated trust of a 4-year-old who recognized a safe person on contact. Carol was sitting at the table with one arm around Liam and her other hand on Sophie's, and she looked up at Adrian with an expression that carried more than her face had room to show. I don't know how to thank you, she said. They found the cabin, Adrian said. I just opened the door. Carol shook her head slowly. She wasn't going to accept that framing, he could see. He didn't push it. Diane Kessel is filing the full fraud case this morning, she said. Victor's attorney is already trying to negotiate. Apparently there are 3 other families in Wyoming who had similar situations. Diane's been in contact with 2 of them since last night. She looked at the table. The land stays with the children. The estate is protected. It's going to take time, but it'll hold, Adrian said. Yes. She looked at him again. Sophie told me about the men last night, what you did. It needed doing. She said, Carol stopped, started again. She said you didn't hesitate, even once. He looked at Sophie, who was leaning against her aunt's shoulder with the specific relief of someone who has finally put down something very heavy and is still getting used to the lightness. Liam was telling Carol about Ghost, the full biography, which was apparently extensive. I need to ask you something, Carol said, and I need you to tell me the honest answer. He waited. The temporary care arrangement, while the estate case resolves, the court is going to assign someone. It should be me, and I'm going to fight for it to be me. But there may be a period, a few weeks, maybe longer, where that's being processed, and the children need to be somewhere stable. She held his gaze. Sophie told me this is the first place she's felt safe since the accident. The wood stove cracked. Outside, a crow landed on the porch railing and then left. I'm not a licensed foster placement, Adrian said. I know. Diane says there's a provision for emergency kinship-style placement when the alternative is a group setting and there's a documented safe environment. It requires a home evaluation. She paused. I looked you up last night while I was driving. I had time. She didn't elaborate on what she'd found. She didn't need to. Will you be evaluated? Adrian looked at the table. at Liam, who had leaned forward to show Ghost the stuffed rabbit in a formal introduction, at Sophie, who was watching Adrian from under her aunt's arm with those eyes that saw more than they were supposed to. "Yes," he said. Carol exhaled. "Okay. It might not pass." "It might," she said. "You have a dog." He looked at her. "Evaluators like dogs," she said simply. The home evaluator arrived 9 days later. Her name was Margaret Cho, and she drove a county vehicle that had seen better years and carried a clipboard and a messenger bag and the specific air of someone who had done this job long enough to see through performances very quickly and was not going to be impressed by a clean house or a prepared speech. She was not impressed by the clean house. Adrian had cleaned it, not for performance, but because it was dirty and he had the time, and then felt faintly foolish about the reasoning. She moved through the cabin methodically, making notes he couldn't read from where he stood, pausing at the rifle case. Locked, documented, properly secured, she checked all of it. And at the bookshelves, where she spent a longer time than he'd expected, reading spines. "Field manuals," she said. "From service." "And the others?" She looked at him. "The novels." He said nothing. "Sophie said you let her borrow one." Margaret Cho made a note. "She said you told her to tell you what she thought of it when she finished." He'd forgotten he'd said that. He'd said it the morning after the arrest, when Sophie had been sitting at the table with not enough to do, and a particular look on her face that he recognized as the look of a person who needed something to occupy their mind at a level below conscious thought. He'd pointed at the shelf and said, "Pick one." She'd picked a thin novel about a man traveling across the American West after a war, which was not what he would have suggested for a 7-year-old, but which she was evidently reading with complete comprehension. "The ramp," Margaret Cho said, going to the door. "Built it last week. He'd put in 4 evenings on it, wider than standard, with a non-slip surface and a gradual grade that Sophie's chair handled without effort. He'd measured it wrong the first time and had to redo the whole left section, which had cost him 2 hours and produced some language he was glad the children hadn't heard. Margaret Cho went outside and looked at the ramp. She didn't make an audible assessment. She came back in and looked at the bedroom, where the children's drawings were now on the wall, 3 of them, which Sophie had done with the markers he'd bought on a supply run to Ridgecrest, and which depicted in stylized form a cabin, a large dog, and what he believed was intended to be himself, rendered in brown marker with a flat expression that was actually fairly accurate. She stood in front of the drawings for a moment. "She drew those," Adrian said. "I can see that." Margaret Cho made a note. "Where do you sleep?" "The chair. Main room." She turned and looked at him. "For 9 days." "The children have the bedroom. I'm fine in the chair." "Mr. Cole." She had a way of saying his name that was not unkind but was also not soft. "I've done 200 of these evaluations. I've seen people set up situations for appearances and then have no intention of maintaining them. I've seen people who genuinely want to do right by a child but don't have the stability or the capacity to follow through." She looked at the drawings again. "And occasionally I see something else." He waited. "The girl has a trauma response pattern," she said. "Hypervigilant, parentified, poor ability to accept help without guilt. You know that." "Yes." "How do you handle it?" He thought about the answer carefully. "I don't push. I give her information when she asks, and I don't explain more than she needs. I let her make decisions where she can make decisions, and I—" He stopped. "And?" she said. "I told her about a teammate I lost," he said, "on the 3rd night. She asked what happened to me. I told her the true version, not the managed version." Margaret Cho looked at him. "Why?" "Because she can tell the difference. She always could." He paused. "She told me I should talk to someone about it." "Should you?" "Probably." He looked at the drawings. She was right. Margaret Cho wrote something, a long something, which he couldn't see and didn't try to. "The legal arrangement your attorney proposed," she said, closing her notebook. "Temporary concurrent placement with Carol Mercer as primary guardian of record and you as secondary residential contact during estate proceedings. You understand that means they could be here, and also means they could leave." "I understand." "You're prepared for the leaving part." He looked at Liam's stuffed rabbit, which was sitting on the table because Liam had left it there that morning, when Carol had taken both children to Ridgecrest for medical appointments and a hot meal at an actual restaurant. The rabbit had one good ear and one ear that was held on by 3 stitches of mismatched thread, and it had been sitting there all morning and Adrian had not moved it. "No," he said, "but I'll manage it." Margaret Cho stood up. "I appreciate the honesty." She picked up her bag. "I'll submit my recommendation to the court by Friday." "What will it say?" She looked at him across the table. "That the environment is stable, the placement is appropriate, and that whoever trained that dog did an exceptional job." She moved toward the door. "And that you should sleep in an actual bed." He held the door open for her. She stopped on the porch and looked at the ramp, then back at him. "You built this in a week?" "4 evenings. It's good work." She went down it. "Get a mattress, Mr. Cole." He watched her vehicle go down the access trail until it was gone. Then he stood on the porch in the cold air and looked at the mountains, and something in his chest that had been wound tight for a very long time was quiet. Not gone. Not resolved into anything simple or clean, just quiet, in the particular way of things that are still present but have stopped demanding constant attention. Like a frequency you've been monitoring that has gone to low static. Still there, still real, but no longer the only thing in the room. He went back inside. The rabbit was still on the table. He sat down across from it and looked at it for a while. And then he reached out and straightened its good ear, which had flopped sideways, and left it there in the afternoon light. Ghost came and put his head on Adrian's knee. Adrian put his hand on the dog's head. Outside, the mountains were very still, and the sky had gone the particular blue of a Montana afternoon in winter. The kind of blue that has no bottom to it, that goes up and up until it becomes something else entirely. He sat there with his hand on his dog and waited for the sound of Carol's car coming back up the road, and the particular compressed chaos of a 4-year-old who had been in a restaurant and a 7-year-old who had been asked medical questions and had opinions about the answers, and all of it felt, in a way he did not have adequate language for and had stopped trying to find, like exactly where he was supposed to be. Carol's car came up the access trail at 4:17 in the afternoon, and Adrian heard it before he saw it. The particular engine note of her Subaru, which had a loose heat shield that rattled on rough terrain and which he'd offered twice to fix and which she'd declined twice, with the specific independence of a woman who had been managing her own vehicle for 20 years and didn't need help starting now. He stood up from the table and went to the door. Liam came through it first, the way Liam came through every door, at speed, with the total commitment of a 4-year-old who experiences thresholds as obstacles to be overcome rather than crossed. He had a paper bag from what appeared to be the Ridgecrest Diner, which he held out to Adrian with both hands in significant ceremony. "We got pie," Liam said. "I picked." "What kind?" "Apple. Sophie wanted cherry, but apple is better." "It is better," Adrian agreed. Sophie came in behind him, maneuvering the chair up the ramp with the practiced, self-sufficient motion she'd developed over the past week. She'd figured out the exact angle and momentum needed to clear the threshold without assistance, and she applied it consistently. And she did not look at Adrian while she did it because she didn't need to, and she knew he understood that. She had a folder tucked against her side, the kind with a metal clip at the top, and she set it on the table and looked at him. "The doctor said the brace fit is wrong," she said. "He wants to do a new casting." "When?" "Next week. He also said—" She stopped, looked at the folder, then back at him. "He said I should be in physical therapy twice a week. There's a place in Ridgecrest. Small, but the therapist trained at a hospital in Missoula, and she knows what she's doing. Okay? It's 45 minutes each way. I know how far Ridgecrest is." She looked at him. "You don't have to—" "Sophie." He said her name the way she said things she wanted people to actually hear. Flat, direct, no softening. "I know the distance. I have a truck. It runs. Let's move on." Something in her face did what it sometimes did. A small giving way, a fraction of a degree, the wall coming down one brick at a time. She nodded. Carol came in last and set a bag of groceries on the counter and gave Adrian a look that said the medical appointment had been more emotionally complicated than Sophie was letting on, which he'd already gathered, and he gave her a look back that said understood, and neither of them said anything about it because Sophie was 7 feet away and read rooms like a field manual. Liam had found Ghost and was explaining about the pie. Margaret Cho's recommendation reached Diane Kessel's office on a Thursday, and Diane called Carol, and Carol called Adrian from the driveway of the cabin because she'd driven up specifically to tell him in person, which he noted without saying anything about it. Approved, Carol said. She was standing in the snow with her hands in her coat pockets and her breath making clouds. Temporary concurrent placement, exactly as proposed. I'm primary guardian of record. You're listed as secondary residential contact for the duration of the estate proceedings. She paused. Diane thinks the estate case resolves in 60 to 90 days. After that, we go back to the court for permanent arrangement. How does that look? Good. Victor's attorney stopped negotiating 3 days ago and started cooperating. Apparently, 2 of his associates in the Wyoming case have agreed to testify against him in exchange for reduced charges, and Victor's position went from negotiable to not negotiable very quickly after that. She looked at the cabin. The land stays with the children, all of it, the water rights, the timber, everything. Adrian looked at the mountains. And the county clerk contacts? Being investigated. Diane thinks one of them flips by end of month. Carol shifted her weight. She had something else to say and she was working up to it, which was not her usual style. She was a direct person, which was clearly a family trait. I want to talk to you about the permanent arrangement. He waited. When the estate case closes, I'll petition for full guardianship. That's not in question. I want them. They're my family, and I will fight whatever I have to fight to have them properly. She met his gaze. But Sophie has said something to me, twice now, and Liam says it in the way Liam says things, which is without knowing he's saying anything important. What does he say? He calls this home. Carol's voice was very steady. Not my apartment in Billings, not his old house. This. She looked at the cabin. And Sophie. Sophie said that this is the first place she hasn't felt like a problem to be managed. The cold air moved through the gap between the trees at the ridge, the sound it always made in late afternoon. The sound Adrian had listened to for 2 winters from the porch without thinking much about it. What are you asking me? He said. I'm asking if you want to be part of this, Carol said. Not a placement, not a secondary contact on a legal form, actually part of it. She paused. I'm a single person with a 2-bedroom apartment and a job that takes me out of town twice a month. You are a single person with a 4-bedroom, well, a 1-bedroom cabin, but there's space, on 4 acres of Montana wilderness, with a therapy dog and a ramp you built in 4 evenings. She looked at him. Those 2 things don't have to be separate. He looked at the cabin, at the ramp, at the smoke from the chimney that Sophie had learned to read. She could now tell him from inside whether the fire needed wood based on the color and density of the smoke, which was a skill she'd developed in approximately 5 days because she paid attention to everything, always. I'm not equipped for this, he said. Nobody is, Carol said. That's not actually a disqualifying condition. He turned that over. I need to think about it. Of course. She started for her car, stopped. For what it's worth, yeah, Sophie doesn't ask for things. You know that. She mentioned the physical therapy distance because she was calculating how many times you'd have to drive her and whether it was reasonable to ask. She wasn't asking me to drive her. She was pre-apologizing for the inconvenience. Yes, Carol said, which is the same thing for her. He understood that. He did the same thing, had been doing it for 2 years, pre-apologizing to the world for his presence in it by removing his presence from places where it might be inconvenient. That was what the mountain was, partially. A pre-apology. Carol got in her car and drove down the trail. Adrian stood on the porch in the cold for a long time. He started seeing Dr. Paulette Oakes in Ridgecrest the 2nd week of February on Sophie's physical therapy days because it was a 45-minute drive each way and there were 2 hours between drop-off and pickup, and he had to do something with them. He'd found her name on a list of veterans' mental health providers that Diane Kessel had included, without comment, in an email about estate paperwork. He'd looked at the list for 4 days before calling. He'd sat in the parking lot of her office for 11 minutes before going inside. He'd spent the first session saying very little, and the second session saying more, and the third session talking about Danny Reeves from Beaumont, Texas, for 53 minutes straight, and when he came out to get Sophie from the PT clinic across the street, he had a headache behind both eyes and felt simultaneously worse and better, in a way that Dr. Oakes had warned him about, and that he was prepared for intellectually and not prepared for in practice. Sophie was in the waiting room when he came in. She took one look at his face and said nothing, which was the correct response. In the truck on the way home, after about 10 minutes of silence, she said, "Was it okay?" "It was hard," he said. "But okay?" He thought about it. Yeah, but okay. She looked back out the window. Good. That was all. He appreciated that it was all. The estate case resolved in 73 days. Victor Hayes pleaded no contest to 3 counts of fraud and 1 count of conspiracy, which his attorney had negotiated down from a longer list with the cooperation he'd started providing in week 4. When it became clear that the Wyoming family's testimonies, combined with the forged notary documentation, made a trial an outcome nobody on his side wanted. He was sentenced to 31 months in a federal facility in Colorado and ordered to pay restitution to the Mercer estate in an amount that covered all legal fees plus a figure that Diane Kessel described to Carol as appropriate in a tone that meant she was pleased with it. The 2 men from the porch pleaded to trespassing and criminal intimidation. The younger one, the one whose wrist Adrian had hyperextended, received probation. The older one received 45 days in probation. The county clerk contact cooperated fully in exchange for no charges, which Diane had mixed feelings about, and which Adrian thought was probably the pragmatic outcome given the alternative. The morning the final estate order was filed, Carol called Adrian from her car again. She had a habit of doing significant calls from her car. He'd come to understand it was how she gave herself permission to feel things without being observed feeling them. It's done, she said. The land is theirs. Water rights, timber, everything. It goes into a protected trust until Sophie is 18. He was in the middle of fixing a section of the porch railing that had developed a wobble he'd been meaning to address for a month. He set down the hammer. Good. Sophie asked me to tell you specifically. Carol's voice had a particular quality. She said, and I'm quoting, "Tell him it worked." He looked at the railing. "Tell her it did." A pause. Adrian, the permanent guardianship petition. I'm filing it next week, and I'm putting your name on it. She said it without preamble, the way she'd apparently decided to stop working up to things. Not as a secondary contact, as co-guardian. He was quiet. You don't have to answer now. Yes, he said. The pause this time was longer. Yes, you'll think about it, or yes, he said again, put my name on it. He heard her exhale. Not dramatically, just the sound of someone who has been holding something and has put it down. Okay, she said. I'll call Diane. He picked up the hammer. The co-guardianship was approved on a Tuesday in April, when the snow was beginning to pull back from the south-facing slopes, and the ridge trail had gone from impassable to merely difficult, and the light was staying past 6 in the evening in a way that changed the quality of everything. Adrian drove to Billings for the court appearance, with Carol and both children. Sophie wore a dress that Carol had bought for the occasion, and which Sophie had opinions about, and which she wore anyway with the particular martyred dignity of a child who has picked her battles and decided this is not one of them. Liam wore a tie that he was very proud of and which was clip-on, which he didn't know, and Adrian didn't tell him. The judge was a compact man in his 60s named Hargrove, who read the petition with the thoroughness of someone who had signed enough of these to know which ones mattered and which ones were routine. And this one was clearly not routine because he looked up twice, once at Sophie, once at Adrian, with the specific attention of a person revising an initial assessment. Mr. Cole, he said, you are aware that co-guardianship is not a temporary arrangement. Yes. You understand the scope of the commitment. Yes. Judge Hargrove looked at Sophie. Sophie, do you understand what this means? Sophie sat straight in her chair. She'd been sitting straight in chairs in rooms full of adults who underestimated her for 8 months now, and she had developed a posture for it. It means he's responsible for me until I'm an adult. In basic terms, yes. Hargrove held her gaze. Is that what you want? Sophie looked at Adrian. It was a brief look. Not searching, not uncertain. The look of someone confirming something already known. Yes, she said. Hargrove looked at Liam, who was examining his tie with extreme focus and had possibly lost the thread of what was happening. Liam. Liam looked up. Do you know why you're here today? Liam thought about it seriously. Because Adrian is our person now, he said. The courtroom was very quiet for a moment. Judge Hargrove wrote something on the petition. That's a reasonable summary, he said. He signed it. Approved. They ate lunch at a restaurant in Billings that Carol chose, which had cloth napkins and more forks than Liam knew the purpose of. and a children's menu that he studied with the concentration of a military planner assessing terrain. Sophie ordered the same thing as Adrian without looking at the menu, which she did sometimes now, mirroring his choices in a way that was not about the food and that he understood without either of them acknowledging it. Carol ordered wine and then looked at Adrian across the table and said, "You should have one too. It's a significant day." "I don't really drink." "I know. I'm saying you could." He looked at the wine list. He ordered a beer, which he drank about half of and which was fine. Liam wanted to know if the restaurant had pie. It had pie. The afternoon light came through the restaurant windows at a low angle, the particular honey-colored light of early April in Montana when the season is turning but hasn't committed yet, and it caught Sophie's face when she was looking out the window at something in the street. A dog, he thought, or maybe just the light itself. And her expression in that unguarded moment was something he'd been watching develop slowly over months. Not healed. That was the wrong word. And he'd stopped using it in his own head. Not fixed or resolved or put back together, but resting. The way a person rests when they've been running a long time and have finally found terrain that doesn't require it. He looked away before she noticed him looking. What? Summer came in sideways the way Montana summers did. A hard week of cold in May that everyone pretended wasn't happening, then a morning in early June when the temperature climbed to 62 before 8 in the morning, and the snow was gone from everything except the highest north-facing ridges, and the air had a different character entirely. Sophie's new brace fit correctly. The PT in Ridgecrest, her name was Jen Whitmore, and she had the no-nonsense patience of someone who'd spent 10 years in pediatric rehabilitation, had developed a program that was pushing Sophie's mobility in ways that her previous care had apparently not attempted, and the results were incremental but visible. She could walk the length of the cabin and back without the chair when she wanted to. She didn't always want to. The chair was faster and more reliable on difficult terrain, and she'd stopped apologizing for using it, which Jen Whitmore had told Adrian was the most important milestone of the whole program. Adrian had relayed that to Sophie, and Sophie had said, "She told me the same thing. She says the goal isn't to use the chair less. It's to use it without feeling like I owe someone an apology." "That's a good goal," Adrian said. "It's a weird thing to have to work on." "Yeah," he agreed. "It is." She'd gone back to her book. She was on her fourth now, working her way along the fiction shelf in no particular order, reading things that were probably not age-appropriate and about which he had chosen not to say anything because she was clearly getting something real from them. She'd told him, about the third book, that she liked the ones where people were still figuring out who they were at the end, not the ones where everyone arrived at a neat conclusion. He'd told her those were his favorite kind too. She'd looked at him with those eyes. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm reading yours." I went back to Dr. Oak's every other week through the spring and summer, driving himself now rather than combining it with Sophie's PT days, because he'd come to understand that treating it as incidental, something he was doing anyway because he was already in town, was a way of managing how much importance he assigned to it, and that was not a useful management strategy. He talked about Danny Reeves. He talked about the two other men who died on the ridge above Mosul on a night in November 6 years ago, whose names he'd been carrying without saying out loud for so long that saying them, Marcus Webb from Decatur, Illinois, who had a laugh that was physically painful to be near because it was so genuine, and Joel Faraday from Sacramento, who'd once walked 3 miles in the wrong direction because he was arguing about baseball and refused to stop long enough to check the GPS, felt like setting something down that he hadn't realized he was still holding. He did not arrive at peace with it. Dr. Oakes did not promise him peace, which was one of the reasons he kept going back. She told him once that the goal wasn't to stop carrying it, but to stop carrying it is the only thing. To have it be one thing among others rather than the weight that everything else organized itself around. He thought about that for a week. Then he told Sophie, because she'd been the one to send him to the office in the first place, that he was starting to understand what the therapist meant. Sophie had been eating breakfast, not looking at him, and she'd said, "Took you long enough?" He'd looked at her. She'd looked back at him with the expression she sometimes wore, the one that was not quite a smile, the one that was better than a smile because it was real. "I'm kidding," she said. "Mostly." "Mostly," he agreed. The first anniversary of the night. Sophie knocked on his door came on a Wednesday in late November, and neither of them said anything about it, which was the right call. A new storm had come in, not the brutal blocking kind of the previous year, but a steady, serious accumulation that put 14 inches down over 2 days and turned the access trail into something you navigated by instinct and experience rather than by sight. Adrian had spent the first day getting the generator and the heating system prepped, running through the same checklist he'd run the previous year, and then had spent the second day doing nothing in particular, reading, fixing a cabinet hinge he'd been ignoring since summer, teaching Liam how to shuffle cards with the full, inefficient, hand-slapping chaos of a 5-year-old learning a new physical skill. Carol was in Billings for work and would be back Friday. The cabin held the three of them, and Ghost in the specific contained warmth of a structure that knows its occupants, that has shaped itself around the rhythms of people living in it. The particular placement of things on shelves, the wear pattern on the floor between the wood stove and the table, the notch on the door frame where Liam's height was marked in pencil at 3-month intervals, the lowest one in faded graphite where Adrian had measured him the first time. The boy standing very straight and trying to make himself taller by sheer force of will. After dinner, Sophie brought the thin novel she'd borrowed from his shelf the previous winter and set it on the table in front of him. He looked at it. "You've had that for a year." "I read it 3 times. She sat across from him. "I wanted to tell you what I thought." He'd said that. He'd said it and forgotten it, and she'd kept it this whole time, the assignment he'd given her without thinking of it as one. "Okay," he said. "What did you think?" She put her hands flat on the table and looked at the cover. "I think he spends the whole book trying to figure out if he deserves to be somewhere," she said. "And the answer is that the question is wrong. You don't deserve to be somewhere. You just are somewhere, and then you decide what you do with it." He looked at her. "That's what I think," she said. Outside, the snow was still coming down, and the chimney smoke was going straight up in the windless cold, and Ghost was asleep beside the wood stove with his legs running through whatever dogs run through in their sleep, and Liam was on the floor nearby in the puddle of light from the lamp, having fallen asleep mid-card shuffle with the deck scattered around him and 3 cards clutched in one hand like he'd intended to play them and simply run out of time. Adrian looked at all of it. "I think you're right," he said. Sophie looked at the book for a moment. Then she slid it back across the table toward him. "I dog-eared some pages," she said. "Sorry." He picked it up and looked at the first dog-ear. The passage she'd marked was one he remembered without reading it. A man standing at the edge of a field at dusk, looking back at a house with lights in the windows, unable to explain in any rational terms why the sight of it made him feel that a long wait had finally come to rest. He closed the book. "Don't apologize for the dog ears," he said. "Well, the physical therapy continued into the fall and the following spring, and Sophie's mobility increased in the incremental, non-dramatic way of real progress, rather than the kind that got written about. She would use the chair for the rest of her life in some contexts and not in others, and the line between those contexts was one she drew herself and adjusted when she wanted to and didn't explain to anyone who asked, because the asking was not actually about her and she'd figured that out. She started school in Ridgecrest that September, a late enrollment, which required some paperwork and a meeting between Carol and the principal that Carol described afterward as constructive, in the specific tone of someone who had been underestimated in a meeting and had handled it decisively. Sophie was placed in 2nd grade, which was technically correct for her age and practically a poor fit for her reading level, and by November the teacher had moved her materials up 2 grades and stopped pretending the official grade assignment was the meaningful one. Her teacher, a woman named Patricia Holst, who had been in the same Ridgecrest classroom for 19 years, called Adrian in for a conference in October, and told him that Sophie was the most self-contained student she'd encountered in 2 decades of teaching, and that she wasn't sure yet whether that was an asset or a concern. Both, Adrian said. Holst looked at him. Is she being supported? Yes. She doesn't ask for help. No, she asks questions. There's a difference. He paused. She asks questions when she needs information. She considers asking for help to be a separate category, and she's working on it. Holst considered that. She reads everything on the classroom shelf. She'll need different books. I know. I've already ordered them. Holst looked at the table between them. Mr. Cole, in 19 years I have seen a handful of children who carry the weight she's carrying. Most of them, she stopped. Most of them needed someone to notice before it was very late. I noticed, Adrian said. Yes. Holst held his gaze. I can see that. He drove home with the windows down despite the October cold, the way he sometimes did when he needed the air moving to think clearly, and he thought about Patricia Holst's face when she said, I can see that. Not flattery, not reassurance, but the simple acknowledgement of a person who was looking at what was actually in front of her and calling it by its right name. The second winter was different in every way that mattered. The storm that came in late November was, by meteorological measure, nearly identical to the one the previous year. Same origin, similar pressure system, comparable accumulation. Adrian ran the same generator check, prepped the same supplies, stacked the same extra cord of wood against the south wall. But the cabin was not the same cabin. The walls that had held nothing but technical literature and operational maps now had Sophie's drawings on 2 of them. A progression over 12 months, from the stylized cabin dog person of that first winter to something more detailed and more personal. A series of small landscapes she'd been making from the north window. The view across the snow to the tree line, rendered in colored pencil with the specific attention of a person who looked at things very carefully before committing to representing them. The latest one had ghost in it, accurate enough to recognize, and a figure that was unmistakably Liam, and on the edge of the frame, almost at the border of the paper, part of a figure she hadn't finished yet. Just a shoulder and an arm, in brown pencil, stopped mid-stroke. She'd left it unfinished on the table one morning, and he'd picked it up to move it, and she'd taken it from him quickly. Not embarrassed, but deliberate, the way you handle something you're not ready for anyone else to assess yet. He didn't ask. He'd learned not to ask the questions that had answers she'd give when she was ready to give them. On the second night of the second storm, he was sitting in the chair by the door, not because anything was threatening, not out of habit from the previous year's vigilance, but simply because it was where he sat now, the way people accumulate positions in a space over time and stop questioning them. When Sophie came out of the bedroom, she moved to the table in the near dark, positioned her chair, and sat across from him. For a while, neither of them said anything. "A year ago," she said. "I know." Outside, the wind worked through the gap in the ridge the way it always did. The wood stove ticked. Ghost was somewhere in the dark behind the table, his breathing audible. "I thought about what I was going to say," she said. "I had something prepared." "What happened to it?" "It was too much," she said. I don't know, formal." He looked at her across the table in the low light. She had grown 2 inches in a year, which was not dramatic but was visible in the way her arms looked when she pushed the wheelchair, the way her face had lengthened slightly. She was still 7 in the legal sense and 8 in the birthday sense, and considerably older in every other sense, and she was looking at him with the same eyes she'd had on the porch that first night, clear and measuring and direct. But something behind them was different now, quieter, less fortified. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "I wanted to, though." He waited. "I was scared," she said. "That night. I was more scared than I let you see." "I know you were." "I knew I had to not show it, because Liam would show it if I did. He reads me." She looked at her hands on the armrests. But I was. I was scared we were going to freeze, and I was scared no one was going to open the door, and I was scared that even if someone did, they were going to call social services, and we'd end up somewhere. She stopped, started again. Somewhere that wasn't safe. And then I opened the door, he said. And then you opened the door. She looked up at him. You looked so... She paused, something almost like amusement in the corner of her expression. You looked so annoyed. He hadn't expected that. I wasn't annoyed. You looked like someone who was trying to figure out what had gone wrong with his evening. I was processing the situation. You were annoyed, she said. He thought about it. Maybe for 1 second. One long second. He looked at her. Are you making fun of me? A little. The almost amusement resolved into something real, brief, unguarded. The smile she had that she didn't deploy often because she hadn't until recently had many places where it felt safe to deploy it. I'm allowed to now. Is that right? Co-guardian, she said. It comes with some license. He looked at the table. He was aware of the specific quality of what was in his chest right now, the thing that had been building quietly for 12 months through the therapy drives and the card games and the drawing on the wall and the dog-eared books and the 45-minute drives to PT and the court hearing and the first day of school drop-off where Liam had cried for 3 minutes and then seen a dog on the sidewalk and been completely fine. All of it accumulating in layers until it had become something he didn't have a word for that was adequate. Sophie, he said. She looked at him. I'm glad you knocked. She held his gaze for a moment. Something moved through her expression, something old and tired that had been there since the first night finally releasing its grip, going out slowly like a light. Someone remembered to turn off at the end of a long day. Me too, she said. The storm moved over the mountains through the night, and the cabin held. And in the morning, Liam came out first the way he always did, loud and immediate and trailing the stuffed rabbit by one ear. And Ghost roused himself from the floor and stretched and yawned with the full theatrical commitment of a dog who takes waking up seriously, and the light came through the snow-covered windows at a low angle that turned the interior a particular shade of pale gold. Adrian made breakfast. Sophie read at the table with her feet tucked up under her, the new book Holst had ordered, which was too advanced for second grade and exactly right for her. Liam told Ghost a detailed account of a dream involving a very large fish, and Ghost listened with every appearance of engagement. The access trail was buried under 14 inches of fresh snow, and the mountains beyond the tree line were white and immense and utterly indifferent, and the cabin sat among them the way it had always sat, small and solid and lit from within, the smoke from the chimney going straight up into the cold, clear air. It was not a perfect life. The PT was hard, and sometimes Sophie cried on the drive home and didn't want to talk about it, and Liam went through a phase of nightmares that lasted 6 weeks and required Adrian to learn, through trial and significant error, how to sit on the edge of a bed at 2 in the morning and say the right nothing. Carol and Adrian disagreed about school decisions twice and resolved them both through conversations that were direct and uncomfortable and ultimately fine. Dr. Oakes told Adrian in March that he was making progress, and in April that he had backslid, and in May that both things could be true simultaneously, which he already knew but needed to hear from someone else. None of it was smooth. None of it arrived at anything that felt permanent or resolved in any absolute sense. It just kept going, the way real things keep going, incrementally, imperfectly, with occasional grace and frequent difficulty, and underneath all of it a steadiness that built in layers until it became something load-bearing. One afternoon in spring, when the snow had fully pulled back from the south slopes and the ridge trail was open for the first time since November, Sophie asked him to take her up to the lookout point where the trail opened onto a view of the full valley. He hadn't been up there since before the previous winter. He went. She couldn't make the steepest section in the chair, and he carried her, which she allowed without comment, which was its own significant thing. At the top, the valley spread out below them. The tree line, The access trail cutting through the snow-gone meadow, the cabin's roof visible through the spruce canopy, the chimney thread of smoke going up into a sky that was the particular Montana blue that had no bottom. She looked at it for a long time. "It looks different from up here," she said. "Everything does." She turned and looked at him. "Do you still think you should have stayed away from people?" He looked at the valley, at the cabin, at the smoke. "No," he said. "Good." She turned back to the view. "Because you're not very good at it anyway." He almost said something and then didn't, because she was right, and because the view was worth looking at, and because Ghost had found something interesting in the spruce needles to the left of the trail, and Liam was chasing after him with the particular reckless joy of a 5-year-old on a hill, and all of it was present and real and asking nothing from him except to be there. He was there. That, in the end, was all it had ever needed to be. Sometimes the greatest distance a person can travel is not across a battlefield or through a storm. It is from the place inside themselves where they decided they were finished, to the door they finally chose to open,